happens when a flight attendant forces a quiet black man out of seat 1A because she believes first class is reserved for people who look the part? What if, less than 20 minutes later, the captain who backed her decision is the one ordered off the aircraft before takeoff? It was supposed to be a routine departure. The boarding door was still open. Passengers were settling into their leather seats, fastening seatbelts, placing expensive carry-ons into overhead bins, and enjoying the calm that usually filled a first-class cabin before departure. Then the senior flight attendant stopped beside seat 1A. She glanced at the man sitting there, then at his simple navy blazer, his worn leather briefcases, and the paperback book resting on his lap. Her expression tightened almost instantly. "Sir," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I'm going to need you to leave this seat." The man slowly looked up. "I'm sorry, seat 1A isn't available for you," without saying another word. He picked up his boarding pass and held it out politely. "It should be under Marcus Ellison." She didn't even look at it. "I don't need to see your boarding pass." Several passengers nearby exchanged curious glances. Marcus kept his voice calm. "I believe you do." The attendant folded her arms. "There's been a seating adjustment. You'll be much more comfortable farther back." Marcus remained seated. "I specifically purchased seat 1A. This conversation is over, sir." The woman waiting in the aisle behind the flight attendant, dressed in designer clothes and wearing diamond jewelry, smiled impatiently, as though she had already been promised the seat. The flight attendant turned toward her with a reassuring nod before looking back at Marcus. "Please stand up before we delay this flight." Not a single person had checked the passenger manifest. Not a single person had verified the boarding record. They had already decided who belonged in first class, simply by looking at him. Marcus calmly slipped the boarding pass back into his jacket. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Would you like to verify the manifest before making that decision?" The flight attendant let out a quiet laugh. "I don't need a computer to know when someone is sitting in the wrong seat." The cabin felt strangely quiet. Some passengers looked away. Others reached for their phones. One young flight attendant standing several rows behind seemed ready to speak, but hesitated. That moment should have ended with a simple scan of a boarding pass. Instead, it became the first mistake in a chain of decisions that would soon cost far more than a single seat, because 19 minutes from now, the captain who chose to support that flight attendant would no longer be flying the aircraft. The aircraft waiting outside the terminal wasn't just another morning flight from New York to Los Angeles. It was one of the airline's flagship routes. Every premium seat had been sold weeks in advance. Most of the passengers in the first-class cabin were executives, attorneys, investors, and celebrities who flew so often that the crew recognized many of them by name. Everything inside the cabin reflected quiet luxury. Cream-colored leather seats, fresh orchids arranged near the galley, crystal glasses waiting beside folded linen napkins. The soft hum of the air conditioning blended with low conversations and the occasional click of expensive watches against polished armrests. For the crew, appearances mattered. Designer luggage, tailored suits, luxury handbags, status often seemed to arrive before a passenger even spoke. Marcus Ellison didn't fit that picture. His navy blazer had clearly been worn for years. Though it was perfectly clean, his brown leather briefcase showed faded corners from decades of travel, instead of scrolling through two phones or giving orders through a Bluetooth headset. He quietly turned another page in the novel resting on his lap. Nothing about him demanded attention, and that was exactly how he preferred it. Few people knew Marcus avoided private jets whenever he wanted to evaluate a company he invested in. He believed people revealed their true character only when they thought no one important was watching. For nearly 30 years, that philosophy had guided every acquisition he had ever made. Today was no different. Only 48 hours earlier, the final signatures had been placed on a confidential agreement that would reshape the future of the airline. The public knew nothing. Most employees knew nothing. Even the flight crew preparing this aircraft had no idea that the man quietly sitting in seat 1A now held the authority to influence every career on board. Marcus hadn't boarded to impress anyone. He hadn't boarded expecting special treatment. In fact, he had instructed the airline's executive office not to notify the crew of his presence. No greeting, no escort, no priority announcement. He wanted one thing, to experience the airline exactly as every ordinary passenger would, because numbers on financial reports could measure profits. Customer surveys could measure satisfaction, but neither could reveal what happened when an employee believed nobody with real authority was watching. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant named Emily discreetly checked the digital passenger manifest on her tablet one final time. Her eyes paused for only a second when she reached seat 1A. Marcus Ellison, everything matched perfectly. Confirmed ticket, verified identity, no seat changes, no upgrade requests, no operational notes requiring relocation. She nodded to herself and locked the screen. There was nothing unusual about the reservation. Nothing at all. At least that's what she believed. Less than a minute later, her senior colleague would ignore every procedure the airline required. And with that single decision, a routine morning departure would become the most expensive flight of her career. No one in the cabin realized the real test that morning wasn't for the passengers. It was for the crew. Marcus Ellison had spent most of his life becoming the kind of man people underestimated. Long before anyone called him a CEO, he had been a baggage handler working overnight shifts to pay for college. He knew what it felt like to be invisible in airports. He knew how quickly people judged a person by their clothes, their luggage, or the color of their skin. He never forgot those years. Success had changed his bank account. It had never changed his habits. He still carried the same style of leather briefcase. He still arrived at the airport early enough to watch the morning crews prepare for departure. And whenever possible, he chose to travel without an entourage. To Marcus, respect meant far more when it wasn't influenced by a title. He quietly closed the novel resting on his lap as passengers continued boarding around him. Without drawing attention, he studied the cabin, not the decor, not the expensive finishes, the people. He noticed the elderly couple across the aisle smiling at every crew member who walked by. He noticed a businessman snapping his fingers at a flight attendant, instead of simply saying, "Excuse me." He noticed Emily, the youngest member of the cabin crew, greeting every passenger with the same warm smile, regardless of where they sat or what they wore. Then he noticed something else. The senior flight attendant. She greeted certain passengers by name before checking the passenger list. She complimented luxury handbags. She laughed a little louder for travelers wearing designer watches, and every few seconds her eyes drifted back towards seat 1A, not with curiosity. With suspicion. Marcus had seen that look before. He had seen it in luxury hotels, private clubs, corporate boardrooms, even at charity galas where people assumed he was part of the catering staff instead of the keynote speaker. It was never really about the seat. It was about who people believed deserved the seat. Most people would have challenged her immediately. Marcus didn't. Experience had taught him something far more valuable than winning an argument. When someone is determined to ignore the truth, they rarely stop after making one bad decision. They keep going, each choice revealing a little more about who they really are. That was why he stayed calm. That was why he never mentioned his position. That was why he simply waited. If the crew followed procedure, the misunderstanding would end in seconds. If they didn't, the responsibility for what came next would belong entirely to them. Marcus glanced once through the cabin window toward the terminal, somewhere inside the airport. Members of the airline's executive transition team were already preparing for meetings that afternoon. None of them knew he was still sitting on the aircraft. None of them knew the culture review had already begun. And none of them could imagine that the first report he would deliver as the airline's new CEO would begin with something as simple as Seat 1A. Marcus hadn't come looking for a confrontation. But the senior flight attendant was about to mistake his patience for weakness, and that mistake would change the course of the entire flight. Sarah Mitchell had worked first class for nearly a decade. Inside the airline, she was known as someone who could handle difficult passengers. She wore that reputation like another piece of her uniform. Every movement was precise, every smile carefully measured. She believed first class wasn't just another cabin. It was an image the airline had to protect. To Sarah, that image depended as much on the passengers as it did on the service.
As boarding continued, she greeted several familiar travelers by name.
"Welcome back, Mr. Harrison. It's good to see you again, Mrs. Collins," when a well-dressed businessman entered the cabin. She immediately offered to hang his tailored coat. A woman carrying a designer handbag received a compliment before she even reached her seat. Then Sarah's eyes drifted back towards seat 1A. Marcus was quietly reading again. No expensive watch, no luxury luggage, no assistant hovering nearby, no visible signs of wealth. In Sarah's mind, none of it fit. She stopped beside Emily. "Did you check him?" Emily looked confused. "His boarding pass?" Sarah nodded toward Marcus. "He doesn't look like our usual first-class passengers." Emily answered carefully. "Everything matched on the manifest." Sarah barely acknowledged the reply. "Computers make mistakes." Emily hesitated. "They rarely do." Sarah gave a dismissive smile. "What they can't do is read people." She adjusted her jacket and glanced toward the elegant woman, still waiting near the boarding door. The passenger wore designer sunglasses, expensive jewelry, and carried herself with complete confidence. Sarah immediately assumed she belonged in seat 1A, without checking another record, without opening the passenger manifest again, without calling operations. Sarah had already made up her mind. To her, the problem wasn't the reservation. The problem was the man sitting in the seat. It was the kind of decision built entirely on assumptions, and assumptions, once spoken aloud inside an aircraft, had a way of becoming evidence against the people who made them. Sarah took one steady breath, straightened her name badge, then began walking towards seat 1A. The next words out of Sarah's mouth would transform a private assumption into a public humiliation one the entire cabin was about to witness. Emily Carter had joined the airline only 6 months earlier. At 26, she was the youngest flight attendant assigned to the first-class cabin that morning. While some of her colleagues relied on instinct, Emily relied on procedure. During training, one lesson had been repeated more than any other. Never assume. Verify. A passenger's appearance meant nothing. The passenger manifest meant everything. That rule had become second nature to her. As Sarah walked towards seat 1A, Emily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her stomach. She unlocked her company tablet once more. Seat 1A, Marcus Ellison. Confirmed. Boarding completed. No upgrade, no downgrade, no seat reassignment. Every field on the screen matched perfectly. She checked again, then a third time. Nothing had changed. Emily looked up just as Sarah stopped beside Marcus. She could already tell where the conversation was heading. Quietly, she stepped closer. "Sarah," she said in a low voice, "careful not to alarm the passengers. The manifest still shows Mr. Ellison in seat 1A. Sarah didn't even turn around. I'm handling it." Emily lowered her voice further. "There isn't any system update requesting a move." Sarah sighed impatiently. "I said, I'm handling it." Emily hesitated. Any dispute involving a premium seat had to begin with a manifest verification. Only after that could a supervisor authorize a reassignment. But Sarah had skipped the very first step. Emily glanced toward Marcus. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't argued. He simply sat there waiting, almost as if he wanted to see whether someone would follow the rules. For a brief moment, Emily considered calling the purser herself. It would have been the safest decision, but Sarah was the senior attendant in charge of the cabin. Challenging her publicly could be seen as insubordination. Emily froze. She hated that feeling. The feeling of knowing what was right while wondering whether she had enough authority to do it. Across the aisle, an elderly couple watched the exchange with growing concern. A businessman slowly lowered his newspaper. Even the elegant woman waiting near the boarding door seemed surprised that the discussion was taking so long. The atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. People weren't watching because of a seating issue anymore. They were watching to see whether the crew would treat a passenger fairly. Emily looked down at her tablet one last time. The words on the screen seemed louder now than the voices around her. Seat 1A confirmed. She took a slow breath. If Sarah ignored the manifest now, there would be no way to claim it had been an honest mistake. It would become a choice. Emily had done everything the airline trained her to do. The next decision belonged to Sarah, and it would turn a simple boarding process into a crisis no one on that aircraft could stop. Sarah stopped directly beside seat 1A. Her polished shoes came to a halt so abruptly that several passengers instinctively looked up. Marcus calmly closed his book and rested it on his lap. He offered a polite smile. "Good morning." Sarah didn't return it. Instead, she crossed her hands in front of her. "Sir, I need you to gather your belongings." Marcus looked at her. Puzzled. "For what reason? You're no longer sitting here." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The nearby conversations faded almost instantly. Marcus reached into the pocket of his blazer and slowly removed his boarding pass. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." He held it out. "My boarding pass confirms seat 1A. Sarah didn't take it." "I've already explained the situation actually," Marcus replied calmly. "You haven't." A few passengers exchanged glances. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper completely. Emily remained several feet away, gripping her tablet tighter than before. Marcus kept the boarding pass extended. "If you'll verify the manifest, I'm sure this will only take a moment." Sarah didn't even look at the document. "I don't need to." Marcus blinked once. "You don't need to verify a passenger's assigned seat? I know who belongs in this cabin." The words landed like a stone. The elegant woman waiting behind, Sarah smiled faintly, convinced the seat would soon be hers. Marcus slowly lowered his boarding pass. He wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed disappointed. "Are you instructing me to leave my confirmed seat without checking the passenger manifest?" Sarah's expression hardened. "I'm instructing you to cooperate, and if I don't, I'll involve my supervisor." Marcus nodded once. "I think that's a wise idea." Sarah appeared almost irritated by how calm he remained. Most passengers argued. Some raised their voices. Others threatened complaints. Marcus did none of those things. He simply asked for the airline to follow its own procedures. To Sarah, his calmness felt less like cooperation and more like resistance. She leaned forward just enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Sir, you're delaying the boarding process." Marcus glanced toward the open aircraft door. Passengers were still boarding. The jet bridge remained connected. There was no delay, only an unnecessary confrontation. Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped forward carefully. Sarah raised one hand without looking back. "Not now!" Emily swallowed. "The manifest still," I said. "Not now." The cabin became uncomfortably quiet. Several passengers had already begun recording with their phones.
An elderly woman whispered to her husband.
"This doesn't seem right." Marcus looked at Sarah one last time. "I've given you every opportunity to verify the facts." Sarah folded her arms. "And I've made my decision." For the first time that morning, Marcus slipped his boarding pass back into his jacket. He looked out the window for a brief second before returning his attention to Sarah. "Then let's make sure your supervisor hears exactly how that decision was made."
Sarah gave a confident nod. Gladly, she turned on her heel and reached for the interphone near the galley.
Within seconds, the mistake stopped being hers alone. By calling her supervisor instead of checking the manifest, Sarah had just transformed a simple seating dispute into an official crew decision, one that the captain himself was about to own. Sarah lifted the interphone mounted beside the forward galley. Her expression never changed. "This is first class," she said. "I need the purser in cabin immediately. We have a passenger refusing crew instructions." She emphasized the last four words. Refusing crew instructions. It was no longer a disagreement over a seat. It had become a question of passenger compliance. Marcus heard every word. He said nothing. Within moments, the purser emerged from the business class cabin. David Reynolds had worked for the airline for almost 15 years. He was respected for keeping flights on schedule and avoiding unnecessary conflict. As he approached, Sarah spoke first. She didn't mention the boarding pass. She didn't mention the passenger manifest. And she certainly didn't mention that she had refused to verify either one. Instead, she summarized the situation in less than 20 seconds. This gentleman is occupying seat 1A and refuses to relocate after repeated instructions. David turned toward Marcus. Sir, is that correct? Marcus met his eyes. Not exactly. David waited. Marcus continued calmly. I presented my boarding pass. I requested that the passenger manifest be verified. Neither request was accepted. Emily stepped forward immediately. That's true. Both Sarah and David looked at her. Emily held up her company tablet. I've checked the manifest 3 times. Seat 1A is assigned to Mr. Marcus Ellison. The system shows no seat reassignment for just a fraction of a second. David hesitated. He looked at Sarah. Did you verify the manifest? Sarah answered without hesitation.
I didn't need to.
David frowned slightly. What do you mean? I've handled first class long enough to recognize when something doesn't add up. Marcus watched quietly. No anger, no interruption, only patience. David extended his hand toward Marcus. May I see your boarding pass, sir? Marcus handed it over immediately. David examined it carefully. Seat 1A, Marcus Ellison. Everything appeared legitimate. He compared the name with Emily's tablet. They matched perfectly. Emily spoke softly. That's exactly what I've been trying to explain. For one brief moment, the situation could still have ended peacefully. All David had to do was acknowledge the error, apologize, allow Marcus to remain in his seat. The aircraft would have departed only a minute late. Instead, David made the decision that would haunt everyone involved. He handed the boarding pass back to Marcus. Sir, he said professionally, would you be willing to move to another seat while we sort this out after takeoff? Marcus looked at him for several seconds. So you agree this seat is assigned to me? David remained silent. Yet you're asking me to surrender it anyway? It's the quickest solution. Marcus gave a slow nod. The quickest solution isn't always the correct one. The purser's shoulders stiffened. We have a flight to operate, and I have a confirmed ticket, Marcus replied. I'm simply asking your crew to follow the procedures your airline created. The words hung in the air. Several passengers nodded almost instinctively. An elderly gentleman across the aisle spoke just loudly enough to be heard. He's right, another passenger added quietly. Why won't they just check the system? Sarah's confidence began to slip. The cabin was no longer automatically on her side. She glanced at David, expecting him to end the discussion. Instead, feeling the pressure of a growing audience and an on-time departure slipping away, David made the worst decision of the morning. He reached for the interphone again. If the passenger refuses my instruction, he paused, I'll need the captain.
Emily's eyes widened. Marcus slowly leaned back into seat 1A. He folded his hands. Then he spoke 6 calm words.
I was hoping it wouldn't reach him. No one understood what he meant. Not yet. The captain believed he was walking into an ordinary passenger dispute. In reality, he was stepping into the single most important decision of his career. The cockpit door opened. Conversations throughout the first-class cabin stopped almost instantly. Passengers instinctively looked toward the front of the aircraft. Captain Richard Lawson stepped into the aisle. He had flown commercial aircraft for nearly 25 years. His uniform was immaculate. 4 gold stripes rested neatly on each shoulder. To most passengers, the captain represented the highest authority on the airplane. And he carried himself that way. He walked directly towards seat 1A. Sarah met him halfway. Her voice was low, but not low enough. The passenger is refusing repeated crew instructions. We've tried everything. He won't cooperate. Captain Lawson gave a brief nod. He never asked to see the manifest. He never asked for the boarding pass. He never asked Emily what she had found. His mind was already made up before he reached Marcus. He stopped beside seat 1A. I'm Captain Lawson. Marcus looked up politely. Good morning, Captain. I understand you're refusing instructions from my crew. Marcus answered calmly. I've refused only one thing, and what's that? Giving up a confirmed seat without anyone verifying the passenger manifest.
The captain folded his arms. My senior crew has already investigated.
Emily's eyes widened. That wasn't true. No investigation had taken place. Marcus spoke evenly. With respect, Captain, no one has verified a single record. The manifest confirms this is my assigned seat. The boarding pass confirms it. I've asked repeatedly for both to be checked. Captain Lawson glanced briefly towards Sarah. She gave him a confident nod. That was all the confirmation he wanted. He turned back to Marcus. My crew has my confidence. Marcus nodded slowly. I'm sure they do, but confidence isn't procedure for the first time. The captain's expression hardened. My responsibility is to ensure this aircraft departs safely and on time, and mine, Marcus replied quietly, is simply to remain in the seat I legally purchased. The words were calm. Measured, impossible to mistake. The captain took one deliberate step closer. I'm giving you a direct instruction. Move to the assigned replacement seat. Marcus remained still. I've yet to hear a lawful reason for leaving seat 1A. A tense silence spread across the cabin. The businessman across the aisle lowered his phone just enough to whisper, "This isn't going to end well." Behind the captain, Emily gathered the courage to speak. Captain, he turned. What is it? She held up her tablet. I've verified the passenger manifest. Seat 1A belongs to Mr. Ellison. There are no operational changes. There has never been a reassignment. For a brief moment, the captain looked at the screen. Everyone expected him to read it. Instead, he pushed the tablet gently back toward Emily. I've heard enough. Emily stared at him in disbelief. But Captain, that's enough. The authority in his voice silenced the entire cabin. Marcus watched quietly, not with frustration. Not with anger, with disappointment. The captain looked directly into his eyes. You now have 2 choices. You may leave this seat voluntarily, or airport security will escort you off this aircraft. Several passengers gasped. Someone near row 2 whispered for staying in his assigned seat. No one answered. Marcus slowly reached for his briefcase. Sarah smiled faintly. She thought he had finally given in. Instead, Marcus removed a slim leather notebook and placed it carefully on his lap. He looked up at the captain. His voice was calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. Captain Lawson, this is your final decision? The captain didn't hesitate.
It is, Marcus gave a single nod. I appreciate the clarity.
The captain frowned.
Clarity? Marcus closed the notebook.
Because from this moment forward, everything that happens is no longer a misunderstanding. It's a decision. The words lingered in the silent cabin long after he finished speaking. Neither Sarah nor the captain understood what they had just committed themselves to, but Emily did. For the first time that morning, she wasn't worried about the passenger. She was worried about her captain. Less than 10 minutes remained before scheduled pushback. The next phone call wouldn't come from airport security. It would come from someone with far greater authority than anyone standing inside that cabin. Captain Lawson turned away first. As soon as airport security arrives, he said, "Remove the passenger." "Yes, Captain," Sarah replied confidently. The captain gave Marcus one last glance before heading back toward the cockpit. To him, the matter was settled. The aircraft would depart. The passenger would be removed. The schedule would be preserved. He couldn't have been more wrong. Marcus watched the cockpit door close. Only then did he quietly reach into the inside pocket of his blazer, not for a badge, not for a legal document, just for his phone. He unlocked it without hurry. No one paid much attention. Sarah certainly didn't. She was already reassuring the elegantly dressed woman waiting nearby. "We'll have seat 1A ready for you in just a moment." The woman smiled. "Thank you." Emily heard those words and felt her stomach tighten. She looked once more at the manifest displayed on her tablet. There it was. Seat 1A, Marcus Ellison confirmed. No exceptions, no changes, no special instructions authorizing removal. She stepped towards Sarah one final time. "Please." Sarah didn't even look up. "What now? The system hasn't changed. It still shows Mr. Ellison in seat 1A. Sarah exhaled impatiently. "The captain has already made his decision." Emily lowered her voice. "The captain made that decision without seeing the manifest." Sarah shrugged. "It doesn't matter anymore." Emily stared at her in disbelief. "It matters because company policy requires verification before relocating a confirmed first-class passenger." Sarah's expression hardened. "You've been with this airline for 6 months. I've been here for 10 years. I think I know how to handle first class." Emily looked down at her tablet again. For the first time that morning, she wasn't questioning Sarah's judgment. She was questioning whether anyone in authority still cared about the airline's own procedures. Across the aisle, Marcus calmly selected a contact on his phone. There was no rush. No visible frustration. When the call connected, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Good morning," a pause. "This is Marcus Ellison." Another pause. "I'm still in seat 1A. He listened for several seconds. Then he spoke one sentence that no one nearby fully understood. "I believe your transition team may want to come to gate 14 immediately." Nothing more. No threats, no accusations, no raised voice. He ended the call, locked his phone, and slipped it back into his pocket. Sarah let out a quiet laugh. "Calling customer service won't change anything." Marcus looked at her calmly. "I wasn't calling customer service," she smirked. "Then who exactly were you calling?" Marcus offered the faintest smile. "I'll let them answer that themselves." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You really think someone's coming to save your seat?" Marcus didn't respond. He simply glanced toward the boarding door. His expression hadn't changed all morning. Still calm, still patient, still waiting. Emily followed his gaze. For reasons she couldn't explain, she suddenly stopped worrying about Marcus. Instead, she found herself wondering who was about to walk through that door. Less than 2 minutes later, the gate agent's phone rang. She answered with her usual professional smile. Within seconds, the smile disappeared. She looked through the aircraft door toward the first-class cabin. Then toward the cockpit. Then back at Marcus. Her face had gone completely pale. The next person to board the aircraft wasn't airport security. It was someone the captain never expected to see at the gate. The gate agent lowered the phone slowly. Her hand was trembling. "Yes, I understand." She listened for another few seconds before quietly replying, "I'll inform the captain immediately." When the call ended, she didn't move. She simply stared through the aircraft door toward seat 1A. Marcus remained exactly where he had been all morning, reading, waiting, as though nothing unusual had happened. Sarah noticed the gate agent's expression and walked toward the boarding door. "Is security here?" The gate agent looked at her but didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Is Mr. Marcus Ellison still on board?" Sarah frowned.
"Yes, good."
The gate agent swallowed. "Someone from corporate operations is on the way." Sarah almost laughed for him, so I've been told. Sarah folded her arms. They're wasting everyone's time. The captain has already made his decision. The gate agent didn't argue. She simply stepped aside. Less than 60 seconds later, a man in a dark charcoal suit hurried down the jet bridge. Unlike most airport executives, he wasn't walking. He was almost running. An airline identification badge hung from his neck. Behind him came another executive carrying a laptop and a thick leather portfolio. Neither of them looked toward the cockpit. Neither spoke to Sarah. Neither acknowledged the purser. They walked straight into the first-class cabin. The taller executive scanned the rows. Then his eyes stopped on seat 1A, his shoulders visibly relaxed. "There he is!" Sarah stepped between them. Excuse me, sir, we're currently resolving a passenger issue. The executive looked at her. What passenger issue? She pointed toward Marcus. This gentleman refused a lawful crew instruction. The executive stared at her for several silent seconds. Then he asked a question that caught everyone off guard. Did anyone verify the manifest before attempting to remove him? Sarah hesitated for the first time. The captain approved the decision. That wasn't my question. Emily, still holding her tablet, quietly stepped forward. I verified it 3 times. The manifest confirms seat 1A belongs to Mr. Ellison. The executive nodded once. I thought so. Sarah's confidence began to crack. I'm sorry. Who are you? The man reached calmly into his jacket and produced an airline executive identification card. He held it up just long enough for the crew to read it. Daniel Brooks, Vice President of Flight Operations. The color drained from David's face. Even Sarah instinctively took half a step backward. The Vice President of Flight Operations rarely appeared at boarding gates, and certainly never without notice. Captain Lawson emerged from the cockpit after hearing unfamiliar voices. He stopped when he recognized Daniel. Daniel, what are you doing here? Daniel didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Marcus. Then he spoke in an unusually measured tone. Captain, I need you to tell me one thing. Before you ordered this passenger removed, did you personally verify the passenger manifest? The captain opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time all morning, he had no immediate answer. The silence was all Daniel needed. He slowly exhaled, then turned toward Marcus. I'm sorry you had to wait, sir. Marcus stood for the first time since boarding. He offered Daniel a courteous handshake. No apology is necessary. I wanted to see how the process worked. Those words echoed through the silent cabin. Sarah looked from Marcus to Daniel, and then back again. She suddenly realized this meeting had never been about a passenger trying to keep a seat. It had been about the crew proving whether they deserved the trust placed in them. And the test had only just begun. Captain Lawson still believed this was an internal operations issue. He had no idea that the next person Daniel was about to call outranked them both and owned the final decision over everyone's future on that aircraft. The silence inside the first-class cabin felt heavier than before. No one reached for an overhead bin. No one resumed their conversations. Even the passengers who had been recording lowered their phones. They sensed the situation had changed. Captain Lawson looked from Daniel Brooks to Marcus Ellison, searching for an explanation. What exactly is going on? He asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out his company phone and checked the screen. I'm waiting for one final confirmation. The captain frowned.
Confirmation of what?
Daniel met his eyes, something that should have been unnecessary if procedures had been followed. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, we've already handled the situation. Daniel turned toward her. No, you escalated it. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Emily quietly looked down. David said nothing. No one defended Sarah this time. A soft chime echoed from Daniel's phone. He glanced at the screen, then without a word, he pressed the speaker button. The cabin remained perfectly still. A calm voice filled the first-class cabin. Daniel. Yes, Mr. Chairman, we've reviewed the boarding records, the passenger manifest, and the live reports from Gate 14. A brief pause followed. Is Mr. Marcus Ellison still on board? Daniel looked toward Marcus. He is, sir. Good, the voice continued. I'd like every member of the flight crew to hear this. Captain Lawson felt his stomach tighten. Sarah's confidence disappeared completely. The chairman spoke slowly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Effective 48 hours ago. Mr. Marcus Ellison became the chief executive officer of this airline. No one moved. No one spoke. The words seemed to freeze the cabin. An elderly passenger quietly removed his glasses. The businessman across the aisle stared at Marcus in disbelief. Emily covered her mouth. Sarah blinked several times, unable to process what she had just heard. The chairman continued. Mr. Ellison requested that his identity remain confidential. He instructed corporate operations not to notify today's crew. He wanted to experience our service exactly as any passenger would. Another long silence followed. Then came the sentence that changed everything, unfortunately. Your crew has now given him that experience. Captain Lawson slowly turned toward Marcus. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at the man standing before him. Not as a difficult passenger, not as someone refusing instructions, but as the person now leading the entire company. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't look satisfied. If anything, he looked disappointed. I never wanted this to become public, he said quietly. I asked for one thing, verify the manifest. No one needed to know who I was. They only needed to do their jobs. Those words struck harder than any accusation because they were true. Daniel lowered his phone. The chairman has one final instruction. Every member of the crew stood completely still. Captain Lawson, Daniel said calmly. You are to surrender command of this aircraft immediately. The captain's face lost all color. What? Your authority over Flight 218 has been suspended pending investigation. You are no longer authorized to operate this aircraft. The words echoed through the silent cabin. For 25 years, Captain Lawson had always been the highest authority on every airplane he commanded. For the first time in his career, someone else had just taken that authority away. And every passenger in first class had witnessed it. The captain thought losing command would be the end of his humiliation. He was wrong. Because the investigation was about to reveal that removing Marcus from seat 1A had never been the crew's only violation. For several long seconds, no one moved. Captain Lawson stood frozen in the aisle, as though he hadn't heard the order correctly. His eyes shifted from Daniel Brooks to Marcus, then back again. There must be some misunderstanding, he finally said. I've been following standard operating procedures. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. No, Captain. You followed assumptions. You ignored procedure. The words echoed through the silent cabin. Captain Lawson tried once more. I acted on information provided by my senior cabin crew. Daniel nodded, and your responsibility as captain was to verify that information before exercising command authority. No one spoke. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. The captain had trusted an opinion instead of the evidence. Daniel extended his hand. Captain, your company identification, please. Lawson hesitated. For 25 years, surrendering that identification had never crossed his mind. Slowly, almost mechanically, he unclipped the airline identification badge from his jacket. Daniel accepted it without a word. Then he turned toward the first officer who had quietly stepped out of the cockpit after hearing the conversation. First Officer Mitchell. Yes. Sir, you are assuming temporary command of this aircraft until a replacement captain arrives. The young first officer nodded immediately. Understood. Captain Lawson stared at him. It was surreal. Only minutes earlier, he had been giving orders from the left seat now. His own first officer had become acting commander of the flight. Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. She stepped forward. Captain. Lawson didn't answer. For the first time all morning, he avoided looking at her because deep down he knew exactly where the mistake had begun. Daniel looked toward the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the delay. Our primary responsibility is your safety, and safety begins with following procedure. We will not depart until that standard has been restored. Several passengers nodded. One businessman quietly started applauding. Another passenger joined him. Within seconds, the applause spread through the first-class cabin. It wasn't loud. It wasn't celebratory. It was recognition. Recognition that someone had finally chosen accountability over convenience. Marcus remained standing beside seat 1A. He didn't acknowledge the applause. Instead, he walked toward Captain Lawson. The captain looked up slowly. Marcus extended his hand. For a moment, Lawson seemed unsure what to do, then he shook it. Marcus spoke quietly enough that only the nearby crew could hear. This didn't happen because you challenged me. It happened because you stopped verifying the truth. The captain lowered his eyes. I understand. Marcus gave a slight nod. I hope you do. Because the lesson wasn't about me. It was about every passenger who boards your aircraft expecting to be treated fairly. Lawson couldn't answer. There was nothing left to say. An airport operations supervisor appeared at the aircraft door. Captain Lawson? He nodded weakly. If you'll come with me, sir, without another word. Captain Richard Lawson picked up his flight bag. Walked the length of the first-class cabin, past every passenger who had witnessed the confrontation, and quietly stepped off the aircraft he had expected to command only 30 minutes earlier. The cabin door remained open. No one spoke as he disappeared down the jet bridge. Sarah watched him leave. Only then did she realize the consequences hadn't reached her yet. The captain was gone. But the investigation into what happened at seat 1A had only begun, and Sarah was about to learn that every decision she made that morning had already been recorded. The cabin door remained open. No one reached for their phones anymore. No one spoke above a whisper. The only sound inside the first-class cabin was the distant activity from the jet bridge as operations personnel moved quickly outside. Sarah stood exactly where Captain Lawson had left her. Her confidence had vanished. The authority she had relied on all morning had disappeared with him. Daniel Brooks looked at his watch. Before this flight continues, he said calmly, we need to establish exactly what happened. He turned toward Emily. You verified the manifest? Yes, sir. How many times? 3. And what did it show? Emily held up her tablet. Seat 1A was assigned to Mr. Marcus Ellison from the moment boarding began. No seat change, no operational reassignment, no upgrade request. Daniel nodded. Thank you. He then looked at David the purser. When you arrived, did you personally verify the manifest? David lowered his eyes. No. Did you inspect the boarding pass?
I did.
And was it valid? Yes. Daniel paused. So you confirmed the passenger held the correct boarding pass, yet you still asked him to surrender his assigned seat. David swallowed. Yes. The answer echoed through the silent cabin. Daniel made a brief note on his tablet. Then he faced Sarah. Miss Mitchell. She lifted her head, though her voice was barely audible. Yes, sir. Did you ever verify Mr. Ellison's reservation before ordering him out of seat 1A? She hesitated. No. Why? Sarah searched for an explanation. I believed. She stopped. Daniel waited. I believed there had been a mistake. What evidence supported that belief? Sarah looked toward the floor. There wasn't any. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. So your decision was based entirely on your personal judgment? Sarah slowly nodded. Yes. Daniel tapped one final note into his tablet. The investigation record will reflect that. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Marcus remained standing beside seat 1A. He hadn't interrupted a single question. He hadn't corrected anyone. He simply allowed the facts to speak for themselves. After a moment, Daniel turned toward him. Mr. Ellison, I'd like to apologize on behalf of every employee who believes this airline should be better than what you've experienced today. Marcus gave a slight nod. I accept the apology, but this was never about me. Several crew members looked up. Marcus continued. Most passengers don't have someone from corporate operations rushing to the gate. They don't have the chairman on speed dial. They don't have the opportunity to expose failures in the system. He looked around the cabin. So ask yourselves one question. If I had been an ordinary passenger, Would anyone have corrected this mistake? No one answered, because everyone already knew the answer. Emily felt a knot in her throat. David closed his eyes briefly. Sarah stood motionless. For the first time that morning, she wasn't thinking about losing her position. She was thinking about every passenger she might have judged before ever checking the facts. Daniel quietly locked his tablet. The preliminary investigation is complete, but personnel decisions. He glanced towards Sarah, and David, our only beginning, the captain, had already lost command within minutes. Sarah would discover that keeping her uniform was no longer her decision to make. No one spoke. The silence inside the first-class cabin had become almost unbearable outside the aircraft. Airport vehicles continued moving across the ramp as though it were just another morning. Inside, everything had changed. Daniel Brooks looked towards Sarah, Miss Mitchell. She slowly raised her eyes. Please hand me your company identification. For a moment, she didn't move. It wasn't defiance, it was disbelief. She had worn that badge every working day for nearly 10 years. It represented countless flights, promotions, and years of seniority. Now Daniel was asking for it in front of an entire cabin of passengers. Her hand trembled as she unclipped it from her uniform. Without a word, she placed it in Daniel's hand. He looked at it briefly before slipping it into his portfolio. Effective immediately, he said calmly. You are removed from active duty pending a formal investigation. Sarah's lips parted. Am I being terminated? Daniel answered with complete honesty. I don't know, that decision belongs to the Employee Review Board, but I can tell you this, you will not work another flight today. Sarah slowly nodded. For the first time all morning, she had nothing left to argue. Daniel turned toward David.
Mr. Reynolds, the purser, stepped forward immediately.
You are relieved of supervisory responsibilities until this investigation is complete. David accepted the decision without protest. I understand, unlike Sarah, he knew exactly why it had happened. He had seen the manifest, he had held Marcus's boarding pass, and despite knowing both were valid, he had still chosen convenience over procedure. Daniel made another note. Your cooperation during today's investigation will be included in the final report. David gave a quiet nod. Thank you. Then Daniel looked toward Emily. The youngest flight attendant immediately stood straighter. You attempted to correct the error.
Yes, sir.
You verified the manifest. Yes, sir, you informed both your senior attendant and the purser. I did. You also attempted to inform the captain. Emily hesitated.
Yes.
Daniel smiled for the first time that morning. You followed company procedure. You did exactly what we train our crews to do. Emily felt her eyes begin to water. She hadn't expected praise. She had only wanted someone to listen. Marcus watched the exchange quietly. Then he spoke, if I may. Daniel stepped aside. Of course, sir. Marcus looked directly at Emily. When you realized something was wrong, you kept choosing the truth even when it was uncomfortable. Emily lowered her eyes. I wasn't sure I'd done enough. Marcus offered a gentle smile. You did more than enough. You reminded everyone here that integrity isn't measured by rank. It's measured by the decisions we make when it's difficult. Emily blinked back tears. Thank you, sir. Marcus then looked around the cabin, at Sarah, at David, at the passengers, who had witnessed every moment. I don't believe people should lose careers because of one honest mistake. The entire cabin listened, but today's problem wasn't one mistake. It was a series of choices. A choice not to verify, a choice not to listen, a choice to protect assumptions instead of facts. He paused, and every one of those choices was completely avoidable. No one disagreed because every person in the cabin had watched those choices unfold, one after another, without anyone forcing them. Daniel closed his portfolio. The replacement captain has arrived. We'll resume boarding procedures shortly. He looked toward Marcus. Mr. Ellison, would you like to continue your journey today? Marcus glanced at seat 1A, then toward the cabin crew. Finally, he smiled faintly. Yes, I believe this flight deserves a chance to begin again. The tension inside the cabin eased for the first time that morning. Not because everyone had escaped the consequences, but because accountability had finally replaced assumption. As passengers settled back into their seats, they thought the story was over. They didn't realize Marcus had one final announcement, one that would change the future of every employee in the airline. The replacement captain arrived quietly. There was no dramatic entrance. No announcement! He simply stepped into the first-class cabin, greeted Daniel Brooks with a handshake, and walked directly to Marcus. Mr. Ellison! Marcus stood. The captain extended his hand. My name is Captain Andrew Foster. I've been assigned to complete today's flight. Marcus shook his hand. Thank you for stepping in. Captain Foster nodded. My responsibility now is to earn back the trust this crew lost. Marcus smiled politely. I hope you do. The captain turned toward the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of every professional who wears this uniform with pride, I sincerely apologize for the delay you've experienced today. We'll be departing shortly, but before we do, I want every passenger here to know something. He paused. No schedule, no performance target, and no passenger complaint is more important than following procedure. Several passengers nodded. A few quietly applauded. This time, the applause spread farther through the cabin, not because someone had won, but because leadership had finally appeared. Captain Foster disappeared into the cockpit to begin his pre-flight checks. Daniel looked toward Marcus. The aircraft is ready whenever you are. Marcus glanced around the cabin one final time. His eyes briefly met Emily's. She gave him a small, grateful smile. He returned it. Then he looked toward the passengers. I owe all of you an apology as well. Several people looked surprised. You shouldn't. An elderly gentleman spoke first. You didn't do anything wrong. Marcus nodded. Perhaps not. But I asked the company to keep my identity confidential. I wanted to see the truth. Unfortunately, you all became part of that test. The businessman who had recorded much of the confrontation raised his hand. Sir, may I ask you something? Marcus smiled. Of course. If you hadn't been the CEO, what do you think would have happened? The question lingered in the air. Marcus answered without hesitation. That's exactly the question that matters. He looked toward Daniel, because if the answer is different, then we haven't built an airline people can truly trust. Daniel slowly nodded. You're right, Marcus continued. Policies don't protect passengers. People who choose to follow those policies do. He looked toward Emily. Today, one employee remembered that. Then he turned toward the rest of the cabin, and beginning today, every employee will. Several passengers exchanged hopeful glances. They realized this flight wasn't ending with punishment. It was beginning with change. Daniel reached into his portfolio and removed a thin folder. He handed it to Marcus. Our transition team prepared this for your review. Marcus opened it. Inside was the agenda for that afternoon's emergency executive meeting. At the top of the first page was a handwritten note. Operational culture review effective immediately. Marcus closed the folder. Good. Let's make sure no passenger ever has to prove they belong in their own seat again. Outside, the jet bridge door finally closed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, 47 minutes behind schedule. Not because of weather, not because of a mechanical issue, but because a simple act of verification had been ignored. As the engines slowly came to life, Marcus looked once more through the cabin. The flight had begun, but the real journey for the airline was only just beginning. By the following morning, every employee in the company would receive an email carrying Marcus Ellison's name, and the lessons from Seat 1A would become mandatory across the entire airline. The story didn't end when Flight 218 landed in Los Angeles. In many ways, it had only begun. Before sunrise the next morning, executives at the airline's headquarters were already gathered in the main boardroom. No one was discussing fuel costs. No one was reviewing quarterly profits. On the large screen at the front of the room was a single title, Incident Review Flight 218. Marcus Ellison entered without an escort. He carried the same worn leather briefcase.
The same calm expression. The room fell silent.
Daniel Brooks stood. Good morning, everyone. As instructed, we've completed the preliminary investigation. A remote clicked. The first slide appeared. Passenger manifest verified. Seat 1A assigned to Marcus Ellison. No changes, no operational override. Another click. Manifest verified by flight attendant Emily Carter. Senior flight attendant Sarah Mitchell ordered the passenger to leave Seat 1A without verification. Purser David Reynolds confirmed the boarding pass, but failed to enforce company procedure. Captain Lawson ordered passenger removal without reviewing the manifest. Corporate operations intervened. Captain relieved of command. No opinions, no speculation, only facts. Marcus looked around the room. This is why documentation matters. It doesn't remember emotions, it remembers decisions. Several executives quietly nodded. Daniel changed to the next slide. It displayed still images taken from the aircraft's cabin cameras. There was Sarah refusing the boarding pass. There was Emily attempting to show the manifest. There was the captain pushing the tablet away without reading it. Every key decision had been recorded. No one could claim they remembered differently. The general counsel closed his notebook. Legally, the company is fortunate. Marcus looked toward him. Why? Because the passenger involved chose accountability instead of litigation. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Marcus answered calmly. I didn't board that aircraft looking for compensation. I boarded looking for the truth, and unfortunately, I found it. Another executive asked, what concerns you most about yesterday? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window overlooking the airport. Aircraft taxied below. Thousands of passengers were beginning another day of travel. Then he spoke. It wasn't that one employee made a poor decision. It was that 3 different levels of authority accepted that decision without demanding evidence. He turned back toward the room. Assumptions traveled faster than facts, and each person with more authority repeated the same mistake. Instead of stopping it, the room remained silent. Because no one could argue, Marcus continued. If Emily hadn't insisted on following procedure, if operations hadn't responded immediately, an innocent passenger would have been removed from a seat he legally purchased. He paused, and no one would have questioned it. Those words carried more weight than any presentation. Daniel clicked to the final slide. Recommendations. Mandatory manifest verification. Crew authority review. Escalation procedure reform. Bias awareness training. Leadership accountability program. Marcus read each line carefully. Then he picked up a pen, one by one. He signed every recommendation. When he finished, he looked around the boardroom. These aren't disciplinary measures. They're promises. Promises that the next passenger, regardless of race, clothing, age, or appearance, will be treated with dignity before assumptions. The directors quietly applauded, not because they were celebrating, but because they knew the airline had reached a turning point. The events of Seat 1A would no longer be remembered as an embarrassing incident. They would become the reason the company changed. Marcus believed new policies could change procedures. But later that afternoon, he would prove that recognizing the right employee could change an entire culture. The emergency executive meeting had ended. Most of the board members returned to their offices. But Marcus remained seated. There was one final item on the agenda. Daniel Brooks looked across the room. Would you like me to bring her in? Marcus nodded a few moments later. The conference room door opened. Emily Carter stepped inside. She had never been on the executive floor before. The polished wood table, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the airline's leadership gathered around one room. It all felt overwhelming. She stopped just inside the doorway. You wanted to see me, sir? Marcus stood, so you must be Emily. She nodded. Yes, Mr. Ellison, please. He smiled warmly. Have a seat, she hesitated. I've never sat at a boardroom table before. Marcus pulled out a chair himself. Then today seems like the perfect day to start. A few executives exchanged approving smiles. Emily sat carefully, still unsure why she had been called. Marcus folded his hands. I've reviewed every report. I've watched every minute of the cabin footage. You had several opportunities to stay quiet. Emily looked down. I almost did. Marcus nodded, I noticed. She took a slow breath. I kept thinking if I stopped speaking, then the manifest wouldn't matter anymore. The rules wouldn't matter. Marcus smiled. And yet you spoke anyway. She nodded softly. I didn't think I was protecting a CEO. I thought I was protecting a passenger. The room became silent. Several board members looked at one another. That single sentence captured everything the airline had hoped its employees believed. Marcus leaned forward. Emily, do you know why I chose to keep my identity hidden? She shook her head. I wanted to discover whether our people respected titles or respected principles.
He paused yesterday. You answered that question. Emily blinked, trying to hold back tears. I was just doing my job.
Marcus smiled.
No, you were protecting the reputation of this airline. The rest of us simply hadn't realized it yet.
Daniel placed a small folder on the table. Marcus slid it across to Emily. She opened it carefully. Inside was an official company letter. Her eyes widened. She looked up in disbelief. I don't understand. Marcus nodded toward the document. You've been selected for the airline's emerging leadership program. Emily stared silently at the page. The program was one of the most competitive in the company. Only a handful of employees were chosen each year. It often led to supervisory and management positions. I've only been here 6 months, she whispered. Marcus smiled. Leadership isn't measured by years. It's measured by decisions, Daniel added. Your training, tuition, and mentorship will be fully funded by the company. Emily could barely speak, you mean? Marcus finished her sentence. We're investing in the kind of leader we want this airline to become. A tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. I don't know what to say. Marcus shook his head gently. You already said everything yesterday when you asked us to verify the manifest. He stood and extended his hand. Emily rose to meet him. As they shook hands, Marcus looked around the room. I want every manager in this company to remember something. You can replace aircraft, you can replace uniforms, you can even replace executives. He looked toward Emily, but never overlooked the employee who has the courage to do the right thing when it's the hardest choice in the room. No one applauded immediately. The words deserved more than applause. They deserved reflection. For several quiet seconds, the boardroom remained still. Then every executive slowly rose to their feet. One after another, they applauded Emily. Not because she had saved the CEO, but because she had protected the values the airline had nearly forgotten. Emily's recognition marked a new beginning for the airline, but before Marcus closed the investigation, he had one final message, not just for his employees, but for every passenger who would ever board one of their aircraft. 3 weeks later, Flight 218 had become more than an internal incident. Without releasing passenger names, without revealing confidential details, the airline had quietly transformed what happened into a company-wide lesson. Every pilot, every flight attendant, every gate agent, every airport supervisor, all of them were now required to complete a new training program. Its title was simple: verify before you decide. It wasn't about public relations. It wasn't about avoiding lawsuits. It was about rebuilding trust. Marcus insisted that every training session begin with the same question. What evidence did you verify before exercising authority? If an employee couldn't answer that question, they weren't ready to make the decision. The philosophy spread quickly. Supervisors began encouraging junior crew members to speak up. Captains were reminded that leadership included listening. Flight attendants were instructed that a passenger's appearance could never replace the passenger manifest for the first time in years. Employees weren't being taught how to avoid complaints. They were being taught how to prevent injustice. One afternoon, Marcus walked quietly through the airline's training center. He wasn't there to give a speech. He simply wanted to observe. Inside one classroom, a senior instructor held up a boarding pass. What is the first thing you do? A new flight attendant answered immediately. Verify the manifest. The instructor smiled. And if a senior crew member tells you not to? The room grew quiet. Then another trainee spoke. We verify it anyway. Marcus smiled to himself. That was the answer he had hoped to hear. As he continued down the hallway, he passed a large framed photograph that had recently been placed outside the training rooms. It wasn't a picture of an airplane. It wasn't the airline's founder. It wasn't even the company logo. It was a simple photograph of an empty first-class seat, seat 1A. Beneath it, a small bronze plaque carried only one sentence. Every passenger deserves dignity before judgment. Marcus stopped for a moment. He looked at the plaque without saying a word. Daniel Brooks, walking beside him, smiled. I thought you'd appreciate that. Marcus nodded. I don't want people to remember me. Daniel looked surprised.
You don't?
Marcus shook his head. No, I want them to remember why that seat mattered. Daniel glanced at the plaque again. I think they will. Marcus smiled faintly. It was never about seat 1A. It was about every seat, every passenger, every decision, every opportunity to choose fairness over assumption. As they walked away, another group of newly hired crew members entered the classroom. Most of them would never know Marcus had once been the passenger at the center of the incident. But they would know the lesson, and for Marcus, that mattered far more than recognition ever could. The investigation was officially closed, but before Marcus moved on, he shared one final message, one that every passenger, every employee, and every leader could carry long after the flight had landed. A month later, the investigation was officially closed. The replacement crew had long since settled into their new routines. The headlines had faded, passengers had moved on, airplanes continued to take off every hour to most people. Flight 218 had become just another story, but for Marcus Ellison, it remained a reminder, not of what had happened to him, but of how easily it could happen to someone else. One quiet evening, Marcus stood alone inside an empty terminal after returning from another business trip. Outside the glass windows, aircraft taxied beneath the fading sunset. Travelers hurried toward their gates, families embraced, children laughed, flight attendants welcomed another cabin full of strangers. Everything looked ordinary, and perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Daniel Brooks walked over, holding 2 cups of coffee. I had a feeling I'd find you here. Marcus accepted one with a grateful smile. You know me too well. Daniel looked through the windows. I've been thinking about that morning. Marcus nodded. So have I after a moment? Daniel asked. Do you ever wish you had simply told them who you were? Marcus smiled thoughtfully. Sometimes, then none of this would have happened. Marcus slowly shook his head. No, only I would have been treated differently. Daniel understood immediately. Marcus continued, my title shouldn't determine whether I'm treated with respect. My race shouldn't determine whether someone believes my boarding pass. My clothes shouldn't determine whether I belong in first class. He paused, watching another aircraft lift into the evening sky. The rules are supposed to protect everyone, especially the people with no power. Daniel remained silent. Marcus took another sip of coffee. I've spent my career building companies, but I've learned something. It's much easier to build buildings than it is to build character. Daniel smiled. And character can't be written into a policy manual. Marcus nodded. No, it's written one decision at a time. He looked back toward the busy terminal. Every employee eventually faces a moment when no supervisor is watching. No executive is standing nearby. No camera seems important, and no one believes today's decision will matter. He smiled gently, but that's exactly when character is tested. Not when everything is easy, not when recognition is guaranteed, but when doing the right thing costs something. Marcus looked at the boarding gate where another first-class line had begun to form. Some passengers wore tailored suits, others wore jeans and sneakers. Some carried designer luggage, others carried backpacks that had clearly seen years of travel. To Marcus, none of it mattered. Every one of them deserved the same thing, to be judged by the facts. Not by assumptions. He quietly finished his coffee and placed the empty cup into a recycling bin. Then he turned toward Daniel. Promise me something. Daniel nodded. What is it? If another passenger ever sits in seat 1A wearing worn-out shoes, Daniel smiled before Marcus could finish. We'll verify the manifest. Marcus smiled back. No, we'll remember they're a person first. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They simply watched another aircraft disappear into the clouds. Because the greatest lesson from Flight 218 had never been about a CEO. It had never been about first class. And it had never been about one captain losing command. It was about a simple truth that should never have been forgotten. Respect should never depend on who someone is. It should begin the moment they walk through the aircraft door. Several months later, passengers boarding the airline noticed something new. Not a redesigned logo, not new uniforms, not upgraded seats, just a small message displayed on the boarding screens before every flight. It read, every passenger deserves respect, every decision deserves verification. Most travelers glanced at it for only a second. Few knew why those words were there. Fewer still knew they had been inspired by an ordinary boarding pass. And a man who refused to surrender the seat he had rightfully purchased. Marcus Ellison never asked the company to tell his story. He never requested interviews. He never appeared in advertisements. In fact, many of the airline's newest employees had no idea their CEO had once been the passenger at the center of Flight 218, and Marcus preferred it that way, because the story had never been about him. It had always been about the choice every person makes when they're given authority over someone else. Weeks after the incident, Marcus boarded another commercial flight. Once again, he traveled alone. Once again, he wore the same simple blazer. The same worn leather briefcase rested beside him. As he reached his seat, a young flight attendant greeted him with a warm smile. Good afternoon, sir. May I see your boarding pass? Marcus handed it over. She checked it carefully, smiled again. Everything looks perfect. Welcome aboard. It lasted less than 5 seconds. Exactly as it should have. Marcus thanked her and took his seat. No confrontation, no assumptions, no embarrassment, just professionalism as the aircraft climbed into the clouds. Marcus looked out the window and smiled to himself. Real change rarely arrives with applause. It arrives quietly, one decision, one employee, one act of integrity at a time. If the events on Flight 218 meant that one future passenger would be treated fairly, then every difficult moment that morning had been worth it, because leadership isn't proven by the power to remove someone from a seat. It's proven by the humility to make sure they're in the right one before asking them to move, and perhaps that's the lesson all of us can carry into our own lives before we judge. Verify, before we assume. Listen, before we decide where someone belongs. Remember that every person deserves the dignity of being seen for who they are, not who we imagine them to be. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been judged before someone took the time to know the truth? And if you believe respect should never depend on appearance, status, or background, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs the reminder, because sometimes the smallest act of fairness can change far more than a single flight. It can change an entire culture.